People can put on an act of being strong. They can pretend to be confident. They can even mimic kindness, drive, and self-control for a while. But no performance lasts forever. There are always small, almost invisible habits that give away the truth. Niccolo Machiavelli understood this better than anyone. In a world swarming with liars, opportunists, flatterers, and cowards, he couldn't gamble on assumptions. He needed certainty. He had to know who was truly capable and who was simply loud. And he learned fast. Real weakness doesn't scream. It leaks quietly through tiny cracks. The truly strong remain composed in silence, but the weak reveal themselves in unconscious patterns. Once you recognize those patterns in rivals, co-workers, or even in yourself, you gain an extraordinary advantage. Machiavelli wielded this knowledge like a blade, the power to expose vulnerability before it turns into a threat. These behaviors aren't obvious at first glance. Most people overlook them entirely, but Machiavelli didn't. He watched human beings the way a hunter tracks its prey. Over time, he discovered 3 key patterns that instantly betrayed a man's fragility. Let's begin with the first, subtle but devastating over-justification. Weak men defend themselves endlessly. Strong men decide and move forward. That's the difference. A man who feels compelled to justify every choice, over-explain every action, or force others to understand him isn't being authentic. He's showing insecurity. Machiavelli observed this in the courts constantly. A confident ruler spoke briefly, issued commands, and left no room for debate. But a pretender, whether a minister, a merchant, or a courtier, talked and talked. He needed his audience to agree with his reasoning so he could feel confident in it himself. This is the behavior of someone whose self-worth depends not on respect or authority, but on being liked. To Machiavelli, this wasn't just insecurity, it was a plea. A man begging for permission to exist. Over-justification is nothing but a smokescreen for fear. Fear of being rejected, fear of being judged, fear of power itself. And the brutal truth is this: any man who needs applause before he acts will never be trusted with real power. Power thrives in restraint. It thrives in conviction. It thrives in making a move without needing to narrate it to anyone. So, the next time someone keeps explaining their viewpoint, repeating themselves, trying to sound agreeable or morally righteous, understand that you're not hearing strength. You're hearing collapse disguised as reason. But that's only the first sign. The second is colder and far more deceptive. Weaponized niceness. This is the deadliest form of weakness because it hides behind a smile. Machiavelli noticed that the weakest men rarely looked timid on the surface. They looked helpful, polite, endlessly accommodating, but their behavior wasn't rooted in virtue. It was rooted in submission. A strong man can be kind, but his kindness is deliberate, limited, and never at the expense of his dignity. A weak man, however, feels compelled to be pleasant all the time. He agrees to dodge tension. He flatters to earn approval. He stays silent when he should speak up. He apologizes not because he's wrong, but because he's afraid. And when this strategy fails, when his niceness doesn't bring the validation he craves, he turns. He grows bitter, sarcastic, and passive-aggressive. Why? Because his kindness was never real kindness. It was manipulation designed to avoid rejection. When it fails, the mask falls. Machiavelli saw this constantly in public life. He famously wrote, "A prince must know how to do wrong and not use it unless compelled." Restraint, in other words, is not fear. But weaponized niceness always comes from fear. It's the posture of someone who doesn't know how to stand tall on his own, so he tries to shrink himself, hoping no one will step on him. When you notice this behavior, this compulsive friendliness that turns sour under stress, you've found someone who cannot handle power. Real power requires boundaries. It demands the ability to say no without apology. It demands facing tension without collapsing into false smiles. Machiavelli kept his eyes open for this pattern because it told him something crucial. This man's loyalty will crumble the second it's tested. Then there is the third sign, the most desperate, the most revealing, and the most humiliating of all. When you see it, you know you're dealing with someone who fears insignificance above everything else. Machiavelli called it a man's addiction to display. You've witnessed it before. The man who constantly needs to be noticed. The one who can't stand a moment without recognition. The one who posts endlessly, speaks the loudest, exaggerates every victory, and turns every situation into a stage. Machiavelli saw these people everywhere, and he understood something few still grasp today. The man who must always be seen is terrified of being forgotten. That fear is not mere vanity, it's weakness at its core. This isn't the weakness of poverty or lack of opportunity. It's the weakness of identity decay. Because display addiction isn't confidence, it's panic. It's the reflex of someone with no solid foundation inside. They believe that if they aren't being talked about, liked, or envied, they cease to matter. Their sense of worth evaporates as soon as attention disappears. And this is exactly why Machiavelli saw such men as liabilities. They will do anything for attention. Lie, embellish, betray, expose secrets, turn on friends, or create enemies out of thin air just to stay in the spotlight. In their minds, silence equals death. Stillness equals invisibility. The worst fate imaginable is to be ignored. Machiavelli understood that a man addicted to display is not free. He's a puppet, waiting to be controlled. If you ever want to break him, you don't have to attack him. You simply ignore him, take away the applause, dim the lights. Watch how fast he unravels. Because while the strong train in private, grow in silence, and strike without warning, the weak man can't survive 5 minutes without an audience. He becomes predictable, easily manipulated, and impossible to trust. This is why Machiavelli feared weakness more than wickedness. At least a wicked man knows what he wants. The weak man wants everything but will trade anything to get it. When you combine all three behaviors, the compulsive justifier, the false nice guy, and the attention addict, you don't get a villain. You get a vacuum. A hollow man who takes the shape of whoever is stronger than him. That was Machiavelli's real fear. Not the loud, not the cruel, but the empty. Because emptiness can be filled with anything, and when the wrong influence comes along, it fills with destruction. But Machiavelli didn't stop at merely identifying weakness. He weaponized it. He turned these behaviors into signals, leverage points, and tools. He knew that spotting a weak man early could be the difference between power and betrayal. Because these men don't break under pressure, they dissolve. And in politics, war, business, or trust, you can't depend on someone who dissolves. So how do you protect yourself? How do you think like Machiavelli? You observe. You stop judging people by their smiles, titles, or eloquence. You start judging them by their patterns, by what they do when nobody agrees with them, when nobody watches, when nobody praises them, and when nobody gives them an incentive to behave well. That's when you see the cracks. The strong don't panic in silence. They build, sharpen, and plan. The weak perform, explain, and collapse. Once you can tell the difference, you gain a weapon. Most people never develop discernment. The ability to see not just who someone pretends to be, but who they will become the moment life stops going their way. That's how Machiavelli chose allies. That's how he avoided downfall, and that's how you outlast everyone still fooled by appearances. Because beneath perfect words and curated images, behavior never lies. Machiavelli didn't just notice weakness, he climbed on it. While other men reacted to weakness with disgust or pity, he responded with strategy. Once you understand someone's emotional fault lines, how they think, how they panic, how they crave approval, you no longer need to argue with them or fight them. You simply guide them. Like pulling the strings of a puppet hidden behind a curtain, he realized something essential. The weak man wants to be led, but hates feeling controlled. So Machiavelli gave them exactly what they craved: praise when they felt invisible, agreement when they felt insecure, flattery when they needed validation. Not because he admired them, but because he saw how easy it was to mold them. That was his true power. He didn't force anyone to obey him. He made the weak obey themselves by keeping them hooked on his approval. Here's how it worked. He'd spot the over-justifier, the man desperate to explain himself. Instead of challenging him, Machiavelli would listen quietly, nod, make eye contact, and say, "That makes sense." Instantly, that man would attach himself to Machiavelli, craving more of that rare validation, willing to defend him, support him, even spy for him, all because he felt understood. But it was never understanding, it was leverage. Then he'd focus on the people-pleaser, the agreeable, eager to help man. He'd give him a role, make him feel chosen, let him feel safe and included. That man would never betray Machiavelli, not out of loyalty, but because betrayal would mean losing the only anchor holding his fragile identity together. And then came the display addict, the man hungry for the spotlight. Machiavelli would hand him a stage. He'd let him speak in meetings, take public credit for ideas that served Machiavelli's goals, wear the costume of influence. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Machiavelli wrote the script. He knew, if you give a weak man the illusion of power, he'll never question who truly holds it. This is how real empires are built. Not only with armies or blood, but with psychological engineering. You identify the weak, then let their desperation build your castle. And if they ever turn on you, you don't retaliate. You simply withdraw the attention. Let them crumble in silence, destroy themselves in their frantic attempt to feel powerful again. Nothing crushes a weak man faster than being ignored by the person whose approval once shaped him. That's the Machiavellian art of handling weakness. You don't debate with it. You don't unmask it. You use it. While the weak scramble for applause, you remain still, silent, and watchful. While they chase validation, you accumulate power. But Machiavelli had one final rule, the coldest of all. Never let a weak man believe he's your equal. The moment he thinks he's on your level, he forgets who built him. He starts to overreach. He dreams of rebellion. So you maintain the gap. You give just enough reward to keep him moving, but never enough for him to believe he no longer needs you. And if he tries to challenge you, you don't punish, you replace. Because the world is overflowing with weak men desperate for validation, but there's only one of you. That's the Machiavellian way, not domination by brute force, but direction by instinct. Not managing people, but pulling the strings of their insecurities until they call it loyalty. You don't need a title. You don't need a crown. You don't even need to raise your voice to control weak men. All you need is observation, silence, and patience. Because the greatest manipulation never looks like manipulation at all. It looks like friendship. It looks like mentorship. It looks like presence. Weak men are not looking for reality. They're scanning for cues. They search for hints of approval the way insects fly into a light they don't understand. Once you recognize that instinct, you realize how easy it is to shape their choices without ever raising your voice. This is the quiet skill Machiavelli wielded. He moved through royal courts, shifting alliances, and entire governments without needing a sword or a crown. He didn't chase the weak. He let them drift toward him like metal to a magnet. And when they arrived, he played his part with precision. He was the patient ear for the compulsive explainer, the steady center for the chronic people-pleaser, and the invisible hand behind the show-off desperate for attention. He didn't fight their flaws. He fed them just enough to keep their engines running. In return, loyalty came without asking, defense without begging, and obedience without a single command. This is the heart of true Machiavellian power, control that never announces itself. The most effective influence is when someone thinks the choice was theirs, when they believe following you was their own idea, when serving you feels like a privilege they chose. Not because you demanded it, but because you never had to. Start here. Speak less than they expect. The weaker the person, the more they crave words of reassurance. So instead of giving them what they want, you offer carefully crafted silence. Silence is not passivity. It's a stage where they reveal themselves. You let them keep talking until they expose their fears, their loyalties, and their secrets. When you do speak, your words land like thunder. A single compliment, a subtle nod, or a rare piece of guidance becomes precious to them. They replay it. They tell others about it. Now they're not just acting alongside you. They're driven by something you planted inside them, a hunger for more of that rare recognition. Then, become the calm they cannot find in themselves. Weak men are ruled by emotional storms. They panic at setbacks. They overreact to criticism. They crumble when they feel ignored. You do none of those things. You remain composed, deliberate, slow to react. You embody the opposite of their chaos. That contrast is hypnotic. They start projecting their hopes onto you. He must know something I don't. He's in control. I should follow him. They hand you authority without you even reaching for it. Next, mix your rewards with unpredictability. This is the pivot most people miss. Don't hand out praise or support like a steady paycheck. That makes you predictable and dull. Instead, make your attention a mystery. Some days you acknowledge them. Some days you are unreachable. Some days you nod. Some days you're silent. Uncertainty creates obsession. They don't know when your approval will arrive, so they work harder, talk more, perform endlessly. They begin to think about you when you're not in the room. You're no longer just a leader to them, you're a riddle they're desperate to solve. This is where psychological leverage begins. Because once they start needing your presence, your guidance, your recognition, they start fearing your withdrawal. You don't need to punish them. Your absence is punishment. You don't need to scold them. Your silence becomes a mirror they can't escape. That's when you own them, not through fear or threats, but through dependency so subtle they call it respect. This is the art, identifying weak men and turning their own behaviors into the gears of your rise. The beauty of it? They will never suspect. They'll label it admiration. They'll call it respect. They'll swear they chose this path themselves. But you'll know better. You watch the cracks form. You read the patterns. While they scrambled for applause, you built power in silence. But Machiavelli also feared something else, the weakness inside himself. He understood a truth most people refuse to face. Weakness is not just an external problem, it's an internal enemy. It sneaks in, quiet and disguised. It appears in over-explaining, in trying too hard to be liked, in craving applause instead of progress, in apologizing out of fear rather than guilt, in staying quiet when you should speak. Self-mastery, for him, wasn't a hobby. It was a battlefield. Lose even one skirmish, and the world would spot the crack before you did. So, he built a system to hunt weakness inside his own habits. First, he watched how he justified himself. When you're strong, you decide. When you're weak, you defend. He trained himself to notice when he began explaining too much, repeating points, or bending his words to fit the room. Each time, he asked, "Is this conviction or a plea for acceptance?" If it was the second, he stopped immediately, because a man who begs for validation has already surrendered authority. Second, he measured how often he said yes. People think agreement is harmless, but he saw it as poison. A careless yes can destroy a kingdom. Yes to avoid conflict. Yes to gain favor. Yes without boundaries. He paused before every agreement and asked, "Would I still say yes if I wasn't afraid of losing approval?" If the answer was no, he declined without apology, without excuse. Because once your word loses weight, you lose power, even in your own mind. Third, he studied his own silence. Weak men dread quiet spaces. They rush to fill them with chatter, jokes, or compliments. But silence reveals everything. Machiavelli turned it into a weapon. He practiced it in crowded rooms. He learned to lean into the tension it created. Because when silence is mastered, it becomes presence. And presence, when sharpened, becomes intimidation without even trying. Fourth, he rejected unnecessary exposure. The weak man is addicted to being seen. The strong man chooses when. Machiavelli trained himself to vanish. While others announced their every move, he stayed in the shadows, setting every piece in place. And when he finally acted, it wasn't viewed as progress, it was viewed as arrival. No build-up, no noise, just impact. This was no accident, it was discipline. He closed every door his enemies could later use against him. Most people skip this step. They perform strength instead of building it. They want to look powerful but never ask the hard questions. Do I chase praise? Do I fear rejection? Do I speak to be agreed with instead of heard? Do I need to be liked before I lead? Do I explain when silence would be stronger? These questions don't just expose weakness, they reveal your ceiling. And once you see it, you have a choice. Feed it and stay small, or kill it and become something the world can't ignore. Because in the real world, you aren't punished for being cruel. You're punished for being predictable, for being emotional, for being weak. So you strip weakness away piece by piece, decision by decision, until one day you speak and people pause. You move and people adjust. You lead and no one dares to ask how you got there. They won't see someone pretending to be strong. They'll see someone forged in silence. Respect is never begged for. It's never requested. It's engineered. Machiavelli knew the blueprint. The highest form of respect, the kind that lingers in your absence, the kind that silences a room before you open your mouth, comes from mastering what weak men fear most. They fear discomfort. They fear being misunderstood. They fear being disliked. They fear standing alone. The Machiavellian man embraces all of it. He doesn't run from tension. He walks into it. He doesn't crumble under judgment. He sharpens under it. Because when you destroy the instinct to justify, when you stop seeking applause, when you erase every fear-driven behavior, you become something alien to ordinary men, something untouchable. That's why people begin to respect you. Not because you're louder, not because you're nicer, but because you reveal nothing, and that terrifies them. Humans fear what they cannot decode. So when you enter a room needing nothing, proving nothing, holding your posture while others flinch, your silence becomes heavier than their loudest words. You no longer chase respect, you become its source. People begin to adjust around you. They measure their words, they lower their voices, they avoid exposing their insecurities in your presence. Why? Because you've mastered what they haven't. You've killed the craving for validation. You've silenced the voice that begged for attention. You've made peace with your own solitude, which makes your approval rare. And rare things are always valuable. This is the final Machiavellian principle. Make your respect expensive. Don't hand it out. Don't flatter freely. Don't smile for nothing. Make people earn it. Because once they realize you're unmoved by charm, pressure, or popularity, they rise to your standard or vanish from your orbit. Either way, you win. You either gain stronger allies or expose the weak ones before they can harm you. This is how you rule, not with shouted power, but with power that's felt. The kind that makes people whisper, "Why does he unsettle me? Why do I care what he thinks? What does he know that I don't?" That's not intimidation. That's presence. And presence is built by removing every trace of weakness from them and from yourself. Because once you've done that, once you've refined your silence, tightened your speech, and made your identity unshakable, you become what Machiavelli admired most. A man who doesn't just earn respect. He leaves people no choice but to give it. Not through cruelty, not through fear, but through sheer, undeniable calibration. You become the standard, the mirror that reflects their insecurities, the quiet proof that real strength never needs an introduction. So let the weak reveal themselves. Let them talk. Let them perform. Let them chase comfort. While they do, you build in precision and silence. Until one day they can't stop watching, and they'll never understand how they lost to someone who never even played their game. That's the final lesson. You don't expose weak men by confronting them. You expose them by never needing to. That is Machiavellian power.